Welcome. It's October 11th, and we are L'Dor Va-Dor, and we are offering you a Touch of Torah study tonight with Rabbi Barry Silver. And we're in the month of, we're in Sukkot, and Simchat Torah is this coming week, and we're going to have a celebration on Sunday when we're going to read from the end of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Genesis. So I think we might be hitting on both of those tonight. We might be talking about Sukkot as well. Take it away, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. We have a passage called V'Zot Habaracha, which means, and this is the blessing. It is the last sedra, or also called parasha, the last section of the Torah. And so we conclude with this section. And then right away on Simchat Torah, which means the joy of the Torah, we conclude the Torah reading and then we begin again, indicating that knowledge and learning never ceases. In Judaism, we don't just study because we want to get smart. We study because we believe there's intrinsic joy in learning and discovering more and more, and that this process should never end. And that's why it's important that we have adults here. Young people are welcome too. Everybody's welcome, but we think it's always good to keep your mind active and to keep learning. And so we now have the last sedra of the Torah, and it's a rather short section. It ends with the death of Moses. It begins with a blessing that Moses gives for all of the 12 tribes of Israel. So he describes each tribe and what their blessing is. And then at the end, there's a blessing. And at the end, rather, there's the description of the death of Moses. It's not that long, but I want to give you something to look forward to on Friday night. So I'm not going to read the description. I'll read it in its entirety on Shabbat if you can make it. If you can't, no worries. Everything is preserved at L'Dor Va-Dor, and you can watch it thereafter. I will just give you some of the highlights. That he lived to be 120 years old, according to the Torah, which is why if you want to give somebody a blessing for a long life, they should live to 120. You don't want to make it 121 because they shouldn't supersede Moses and be superior in some way to Moses. It also says that the people wailed and mourned for 30 days. And that's where we get the term shloshim, a 30-day period of mourning, which is customary for those who have died. Shalosh is 3, and shloshim is 30 in Hebrew. And so we also have another description of Moses. It says that his strength had not abated and he still had his vigor. Well, if that's the case, you kind of wonder, wait a minute, if he wasn't weak and he still had his vigor, why did he die at that age? It's kind of giving the impression that God felt, okay, that's as long as anybody needs to live. And even if you don't have any illnesses, you've done your part. Now it's time to move on and make way for the next generation. It does say also that Moses transferred his leadership to Joshua. In biblical days, it wasn't enough just to transfer leadership. He had to transfer his power. Therefore, it says that the Hebrew word is samach. Who samach et hayadav, he put his hands upon his successor, upon Joshua, and then he transmitted in this way his power, his energy to Joshua. And so that samach is called samicha, and now if a rabbi is ordained, he is conferred smicha. It's a little more complicated today than it was in the old days. So now if you want to be a rabbi, usually you have to do more than have somebody place their hands upon you. But this happens too. In traditional Judaism, even the very Orthodox, if one rabbi is satisfied that a disciple is knowledgeable and knows what he's doing, then he puts his hands upon him and gives him smicha. In modern America, if you want to become a rabbi, you have to go to the religious institution of your particular denomination. There's a conservative school and an Orthodox Reform. If you want to go to the one where the toughest kids hang out, that's the Reform school. They graduate. They're tough kids because they graduate from a reform school. So they all go to the ordination of their particular denomination, and they get ordained in that way. Normally, it's 4 years of college, and then you go to the rabbinical school of your denomination. And in the Reform movement, we spend some time in Israel. That's customary, and they teach you a little bit of spoken Hebrew. Most rabbis don't speak Hebrew. Most rabbis read Hebrew, and they can translate much of biblical Hebrew, but they cannot speak conversational Hebrew. They don't teach that. Of course, some rabbis do. If they decide to take it upon themselves to learn how to speak Hebrew conversationally, they can do that. But most of them do not. And non-Jews are often surprised to hear that most Jewish people don't speak Hebrew at all. They just figure, oh, if you're Jewish, you speak Hebrew, not realizing the amount of time it takes to learn a language. The other thing that's rather interesting about this passage is that it describes the death of Moses in the third person. So Moses is describing his own death as if it's happening to someone else. And it says, and his power was not abated, and he went off and he died. He was taken to lie with his fathers. What's interesting about this is that to a rational thinker, this is a dead giveaway that Moses didn't write it. If Moses was writing this, why would he refer to himself in the third person? Some people say, well, he still could have done it. It's still possible that he wrote this describing himself in this third person. Some people do, but then you got another problem. The other problem is says there's never been another prophet like Moses, as great as Moses, who spoke to God face to face. Moses was characteristically shy and modest and had humility. So this is very uncharacteristic of Moses. He normally wouldn't have said something like that. But the traditionalists say, well, that's true, but he could have said that. Maybe he was being uncharacteristically immodest at the end of his life. Maybe he was kind of old, and so he was not maintaining his normal way of behaving. They could explain that too. But there's one thing that cannot be explained, not rationally. I'm going to try to find it here. Okay. Here it is. It goes as follows. V'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe asher yad'o Adonai panim el panim. There has never arisen another prophet like Moses that God knew punim to punim, or panim el panim in Hebrew, face to face. V'chol ha'odot v'hamoftim asher shalacho Adonai la'asot be'eretz Mitzrayim, who did so many incredible things and miracles in the land of Egypt. LePharaoh, to Pharaoh, ulechol avadav, and to all of his servants, ulechol also, and to his land, ulechol hayad hachazakah, ulechol hamorah hagadol. Never has any prophet been able to exert the power of God through a powerful hand and great sights. Asher asa Moshe le'enei kol Yisrael, which Moses performed in the land of Israel. What this is saying is that until this time, from the time of Moses until today, no prophet has ever arisen. That could not have been written by Moses. That had to be written after Moses, because it's saying from the time of Moses until today, there has never arisen another prophet like Moses. It doesn't say there never arose in the past. It's saying until this time. So it had to have been written at a time after the death of Moses. That's something that rationally you can't explain. And that's why one of many, 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 many reasons why we accept that the Torah was not written by Moses, but was written by people afterwards, at least this part of it. I'll now open it up to questions or comments. Does anyone have any things that they would like to share? or questions or comments. Feel free to disagree with my interpretations or to agree, whatever you like. Everything, it's all fair game.
Rabbi,
Well,
Beth,
it's
yeah,
oh,
yeah,
go
Rabbi,
ahead, Beth.
my nephew in Chabad told me at one point that there are people within Orthodoxy who are willing to concede the possibility that Joshua wrote the last couple of lines.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, and that's it. Oh,
Yes,
by the way, before I mute myself, I a few weeks ago I sent you those links to those YouTube channels about comparative religion. Did you get them?
I believe I did. I
Okay.
haven't reviewed them yet, but I did. Yes. Thank you.
I was going to say that perhaps those last few lines, like Jeff said, might have been written by somebody else, but might have been added on later on, because they said they found the book of Deuteronomy separate from all the other books. Is that true?
Yeah, they did. Deuteronomy was discovered long afterwards, but here's the rub. It's supposedly Deuteronomy was discovered when they returned back to Israel after the Babylonian captivity. It's around the 5th century BCE. They came back and they say, "Oh, look what we found in the temple among the ruins. We found this book that happened to agree exactly with the teachings of the current administration." So obviously a scribe must have put that together. But here's the problem. If you say, well, and you're right, in Chabad, the Orthodox say, well, I guess that's a way around it. So what they're doing is they're in desperation saying, well, maybe Moses didn't write this part. But once you do that, then you say, well, if he didn't write that part, maybe he didn't write the paragraph before that, or maybe the one before that. So once you open the door, it's very dangerous. And it brings up the whole question, well, the Torah that we have, who said that all of that was written by Moses, including that last paragraph? Why do we think that? And if the last paragraph wasn't, what about the other ones? The bigger way they get around it, the much bigger way, is with the oral law. The oral law saying that, well, God wrote the Torah through Moses, but he also dictated it to Moses. And so there's all types of ways to get around it and contradict it and say this isn't really accurate because the oral law supersedes it or clarifies it. But yeah, that's the problem. There's a little chink in the armor if you say he didn't write the last part. And so usually they don't do it, but that is claimed by some in Chabad, some of the very Orthodox. By the way, if you have relatives in Chabad or friends or know the Chabad rabbi, and they would like to come on and join us in the Torah discussion and share their point of view, or even engage in a comparison or a debate, they are welcome to be here anytime. We think that it's very harmful not to have people of different backgrounds within Judaism sharing points of view and only to talk to ourselves. So we welcome Chabad or atheist Jews or conservative or other religions. Anybody is welcome here, especially fellow Jews. Anybody else?
Can we talk a little bit about Sukkot?
Yeah, Valerie, I think, wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I just don't understand why when you have a parallel instrument, if you will, like the Talmud, that was supposedly written thousands of years after the 5 books of Moses supposedly was written by whomever, why in all of these years has there not been an updated or a rabbinical council gathered to update the Talmud to interpret in a modern way the words of the Torah?
That's a very good question. The reason is very simple. The Orthodox maintain that their religion comes from God. If people were to say, hey, let's do an updated version of the Torah or the Talmud, it would be invalid, because now what you're doing is you're saying, well, God's word isn't so special. We need human beings to improve upon his handiwork. That would be blasphemous. So what the Orthodox do is they don't change it. They have later developments where people interpret it or explain it, but they can't change it, or supposedly they can't contradict it. The problem they have is that the Torah has things that are very, very barbaric. And by the time of the Talmudic period, around 2,000 years ago, the Jews have outgrown that. They didn't want to stone a disrespectful child. They didn't want to stone an adulterer. Under Roman times, adultery was committed. They didn't want to say that you could never divorce. They didn't want to say that if somebody violated the Sabbath in some minor way, they should be stoned to death. They had outgrown that. But they couldn't just say, well, God's word, let's just disregard it. And let's just say, well, these parts, they weren't really written by God. Or these parts God wrote, but we've outgrown that. They can't say that. So they were stuck 1,500 years after the Torah was written with a document that they said was written by God, which they didn't want to carry out. So they did some clever things. They came up with the Talmud, but you can't say that human beings wrote the Talmud to improve upon God's handiwork. So they had to say the Talmud came from God. And in utter sheer desperation, they said the Talmud was actually dictated by God to Moses simultaneously with the giving of the Torah, and he gave it to him orally. And then Moses passed it down to Joshua, word for word, verbatim, a document that's far longer than the Torah. He remembered all of it, even though he heard it when he was at least around 100 years old, and dictated to Joshua word for word. Joshua then dictated it again, word for word, what he heard, to the elders. And they did it to the next generation for 1,500 years in a very, very long game of telephone tag that nobody even mentioned for 1,500 years that they were playing. Then 1,500 years later, Akiba and some of the Talmudists said, by the way, God dictated the oral law. I think it's about time we might write it down. So maybe we should write it down. They set it forth in the Talmud in a way that contradicted itself. You had different rabbis saying different things, and you had the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, which were also very different. But supposedly this had all been dictated by God. So this is a real serious, desperate move to say it all came from God. It reminds me of the line, what lengths I can't remember. What a web we weave.
Oh, what tangled webs we weave in order to deceive.
When first we practice to deceive, right? Yeah. So by trying to fix it and make it seem that it's all plausible, it gets more and more implausible and more convoluted. It's much easier just to say people wrote it. Now you don't have to play all these mind games and gymnastics, linguistic gymnastics, and you can just say people wrote it, which is what Reform does and Reconstructionists and Humanistic do. The problem for the Orthodox is then you're not anchored in something that is absolute. And so it's a little scary for them to lose that absolute basis and start winging it. So that's why they came up with this.
Rabbi, is the oral law and the Talmud equivalent?
Yeah, it's the same, yes. The oral law, according to Orthodox teaching, was codified in the Talmud. It wasn't written down earlier according to the Orthodox, because what they said was very interesting. They said they didn't want to write it down because it would lose its flexibility. They wanted the law to be flexible. So it sounds very much like they're arguing the Reform point of view. They don't want to write it down. And if it was dictated by God, why would you want flexibility? And why would you want it to be interpreted in all these? So it makes absolutely no sense. If it was really dictated by God to Moses, the first thing he would have done was gone to the nearest scribe and say, take some notes here before I forget. This God just told me this stuff. I don't want to forget it. And Joshua would have done the same thing. But yes, the oral law and the Talmud and the Mishnah are basically, it's all the same thing.
It seems like with the oral law, you're a lawyer. It seems like they built in culpable, negligence,
Well, here's what they did in the oral law. It's very clever.
Culpable negligence. I mean, I didn't say that.
Here's what they did. The rabbis of the Talmud, by our standards, by the year 2022, they were rather primitive, in some cases extremely intolerant, in some cases misogynistic, but they were light years ahead of the Torah morality, which in many ways was like Sharia law. So they were very advanced and tried to ameliorate and tried to soften and tried to add more compassion to the Torah, but they couldn't just change it. So here's what they did. things like this. Well, the Torah says that if you commit adultery, you should be stoned to death. And we're not going to change that. That's true. However, we're going to require, before that can be done, you need to have 10 witnesses. Now, I ask you, how often would there be 10 witnesses to people committing adultery? And how often would that actually take place in real life? These clever devices were used throughout the Talmud in order to get around the harshness of the Torah. They also said that the Sanhedrin, which had the ability to impose the death penalty, if the Sanhedrin imposed the death penalty even once during the lifetime of any given high priest, it was considered a harsh and cruel court. So they didn't say you can't do it. They just said it would be very harsh if you did. So the Talmud is very, very much advanced compared to the Torah in many ways. But what we should not lose sight of is that even though the Torah was a product of its time, it's still timeless in that it had ideals and aspirations and hopes and dreams of the Jewish people thousands of years ago that really transcended what was going on at that time and still provide the moral basis for Western civilization. The ideals and the dreams of Martin Luther King came from Amos, and the ideals of the United Nations, of joining the nations together in peace, came from Isaiah. And the belief that human beings can create a world of peace and justice came from Jeremiah and the Jewish prophets. These ideals are very, very far ahead of their time, and still give us a guidepost for what we seek to accomplish today. So we shouldn't allow others to disparage the Torah as if it's all primitive. It was a product of its time. And if you consider that it was written by human beings, then it is an incredibly foresighted and inspiring document. If you consider it to be written by God, then as Christopher Hitchens said, let's just hope he was having a bad day. Because by God's standards, it was not perfect, but by human standards, quite enlightened. I would like to share a little bit about Sukkot. You know, these holidays now get sandwiched together, and you don't really get a chance to bring out the significance of these holidays. Sukkot is one of what we call the pilgrim holidays. There's an English word, peregrinate, which is related to pilgrim. It means to go on a voyage or a journey. That's where they get the word pilgrim. The Hebrew word has nothing to do with to wander around. It's called Chag, and we use it generally for a holiday. But in biblical times, there were 3 Chagim, 3 holidays, 3 main holidays, and they were Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And they were all agricultural originally. Passover is the springtime when you plant. Shavuot is the first harvest. And then Sukkot is the second harvest because it was a tropical climate. These agricultural holidays, as Jewish history progressed, were then overlaid with a historical event. So you have Passover, which became connected up with the liberation of the Jews from Egypt. The land had died in the wintertime, and then it had rebirth in the spring, and the Jews were reborn as a people. Shavuot was the first fruits, the first harvest, and the first fruits was then compared to the 10 Commandments, which were given to the people at Sinai, and that was linked up with Shavuot, the first harvest. The second harvest was linked up with Sukkot, with agriculture, and with giving thanks, a Thanksgiving holiday, which gave rise to the modern day holiday of Thanksgiving. The founding fathers looked into the Bible and came up with Thanksgiving, patterned after Sukkot. You can see parallels, giving thanks to nature, giving thanks for the bounty, giving thanks for being able to survive a difficult trek and ordeal through the desert, and then being able to celebrate Thanksgiving. So the Sukkot holiday is a thank you to God, and to thank God for getting us through the Exodus, completing the journey in booths or huts called a sukkah. In actuality, historians kind of doubt that Jews actually built wooden structures to accommodate 600,000 wanderers in a wilderness area that was short on trees and wood. So they kind of doubt the fact that Jews built wooden structures and schlepped them through the wilderness. But Sukkot reminds us today of the gift of nature, the beauty of nature, the wonder of nature, and gives thanks for the harvest and for this beautiful planet. And the sukkah is a covering, giving thanks for the fact that Jewish people have been protected over the years. Our ancestors thought by a supernatural being, we might believe that we were protected and strengthened by our values, our beliefs, and our ideals, which could never be conquered by any physical enemy. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or thoughts they'd like to share about Sukkot?
Some of what I found was when that the fields were not in the cities, the fields were outside. So when they had to do their harvest, they would go and they would live out near the fields, and they would build those temporary structures, thus a sukkah or a booth out near their fields, so that they could sleep and eat there while they were harvesting, because it wouldn't be done in one day. They didn't have the machinery. So isn't that where the terminology came from, when they were harvesting outside of the towns?
Yeah, well, when we come up with explanations to try to explain where things really came from, what normally happens is the original explanation seems totally implausible. So they try to come up with another one that makes more sense. And usually, if the Orthodox are doing it, it makes a little more sense, but not much more sense. So yes, that's more plausible than to say that all the Jews had wooden huts that they schlepped around with them throughout their wanderings in the desert. 600,000 people who, actually 600,000 Jewish soldiers, even more, millions of people traversing the desert or the wilderness, which doesn't seem very plausible. If we just use our common sense, it doesn't make sense that Jews living, let's say, 3,000 years ago, or even 2,000 years ago, lived in the city. Okay, there weren't cities in Judea. There was Jerusalem, and there might have been maybe one or two other city type places, but Judea was agricultural. If you read the historical accounts, these were agricultural areas. It's not like everybody was living in Manhattan, and then all of a sudden they said, hey, you know what, it's the harvest time, let's go out to the field now. They had to live in the field. If you're a farmer, you don't just kind of wander out there around harvest time, hey, let's go pick the harvest. I mean, you got to spend your time day in, day out throughout the year. So the idea that they were kind of living, they were all hanging out in the city, then they went out to the harvest, it's I guess it's a little more plausible, but not much more. It is possible that some people did that. Some people went out to that area, but to suggest that the Jewish people as a whole, or even any sizable portion of them, did that is not very likely, and certainly is inconsistent with the historical records of what we know Judea was like. It was agricultural, pretty much.
My other question was about the lulav and the etrog. When would those
customs,
traditions, custom for the lulav and the etrog, where would they have come from? Israel, probably, because the etrog grew in Israel. And So how old would that custom be?
We think that's pretty ancient because the connection up of Sukkot and Shavuot and Pesach with agriculture seems to have taken place a very, very, very long time ago. And these two symbols are agricultural in nature, and the historical record seems to go back quite a long time. And there's some very interesting symbolism that, Sharon, I know you're familiar with because you've shared that with us and you've explained that to us, which I think is a very, very beautiful symbolism, which we'll be sharing on Sukkot. So I do encourage people, I don't want to give everything away now, but I do encourage people to join with us on Sukkot. It's really a beautiful holiday, and the symbols are really nice, and it's really great to surround ourselves and to appreciate nature. I believe that it would be hard to dispute that modern humans are very cut off from nature, and that this is a very dangerous situation, that we feel like we're not at one with nature. We don't feel like the earth, that we're part of the earth. We feel that the earth belongs to us, not that we belong to the earth. It's a very dangerous approach, like the conquest of nature, instead of seeking to live in harmony with it. Sukkot tries to bring us back to a time when we're one with nature and appreciation of nature. Our ancestors were a lot closer to that than we are, and they appreciated nature and gave thanks. So I encourage people to join with us. Should be a fun gathering. It's not going to be a bunch of prayers and things. It's going to be a little bit of spirituality and a lot of singing, a lot of joy, a lot of just hanging out with each other and celebrating the fact that the pandemic seems to be winding down and we can now rejoice. Sukkot is called the Chag Simchatenu, the holiday of our joy. It's a very joyous holiday. And so we're going to capture that mood by having a good time on Sukkot. And Sharon can give you some of the details.
I can. On Friday night, please come out to the Carlisle for our Shabbat, because we're going to, whoever's there is going to be invited to participate with the lulav and etrog. And we hope that you'll join us for the service. And then on Sunday, it's going to be a lot of fun with Simchat Torah and the Torahs, and we'll have a pizza in the park. And but we do need to know who's coming by the latest by tomorrow, so that we can order the food on Thursday. So we invite everybody to come that's local and to join us at the West Boynton Park at 3 p.m. on Sunday. Should be a lot of fun. And it's outdoors and beautiful, hopefully a beautiful day. If not, we have a cover over us, and we'll have a good time. We'll have Andy Sussman with us singing, and Rabbi Barry singing, I'm sure, too. And it'll be a fun time.
Some things are just unavoidable, Sharon. I do want to share something with you. Since everyone here has taken the time to join with us, which I appreciate, there is a new development in the lawsuit by L'Dor Va-Dor against the state of Florida. And you are the first to know about it, because I haven't told anyone other than my co-counsel and another person who's helping to spread the word about the case. But it will make the headlines tomorrow, I imagine. It will be done tomorrow. So let me just share with you that the lawsuit is complicated. It raises significant constitutional issues, and there are folks on the other side, the state of Florida and Governor DeSantis, who are fighting and opposing this vigorously. So we're up against some rather daunting odds. And also judges in Tallahassee who may not be too receptive to the arguments that we're raising. So what happened was there were different things that caused a lot of stalling in the case. And then yesterday, the judge assigned to the case made a ruling which would have buried this case for a very long time. And without even giving us a hearing or even allowing us to say one word, probably would have tossed the case into the dustbin of history at a time when the administration doesn't want a word about abortion being mentioned and doesn't want any headlines or anything, it would have just buried this for a long time. I'm filing a motion tomorrow, which should cause that to backfire significantly. And the motion will be, well, you'll find out. I don't want to give everything away, but it's going to be to disqualify the trial judge and to find a new judge. That does not happen very often, only under rather unusual circumstances. I believe those circumstances have clearly been met. And I'm going over with my co-counsel now the contours of that motion. We've been working on it for the better part of the day, and should be done by tomorrow. It has to be done under oath. It has to be a verified pleading in which I swear under oath that the allegations are true to the best of my knowledge. And so stay tuned. It will be shared through our website, through my website, probably through our newsletter. And I encourage you to check it out and spread the word. It's very, very, very interesting issues that are being raised. In addition, I also wrote something about the coming elections. And what I wrote about the elections is highly partisan. It cannot be claimed that this is something that is nonpartisan. Now, it's true that I criticize both parties, Democrat and Republican, but when something I write is overtly political, I don't put it on the L'Dor Va-Dor website, and I don't think Sharon would share it either with the newsletter, but it is going to be on my website. My website is my personal website. I can put anything I want on there. That's at rabbibarrysilver.com. It's a very interesting article, I believe, about the election. It's something you've never seen before. And not surprisingly, it's rather hard-hitting. And if you agree with it, please send it out to your friends. If you disagree with it, please share with me why. Because I am interested in engaging in dialogue, and I really make it a point to do everything I can to make sure every word and every syllable that I say can be backed up with reason and fact and evidence. And if not, I'm not offended. I want to hear from you, because sometimes people say, hey, Rabbi, what about this? And it allows me to refine it or to improve upon it. So check that out also. Like I said, you won't find it at L'Dor Va-Dor at all, but you will find it on my website, rabbibarrysilver.com, and I'm glad to hear from you. And as always, if you know anyone who will mix it up with me and share in a debate or anything, let me know. I am debating our favorite antagonist, Alan Bergstein, who's a Republican, about which political party best reflects Jewish ideals. And he unfortunately said he doesn't want it taped or recorded, and he won't allow anyone to hear it afterwards, which is very unfortunate, because I think it would be interesting for others to hear. And there's only 50 people allowed in the room. So I guess he doesn't really want this to be heard by other people, but I do. So if you know of any other people that are interested in scheduling a debate or contrasting views, let me know. And I'm not going to share with you my arguments. I don't want him to know it ahead of time, but I will just tell you this. I'm going to start out by saying, I want to compliment Alan. He's one of the bravest people that I know. He's got more courage than anyone. He's actually willing to stand up here and defend the Republican Party and make you think or try to argue that the Republican Party reflects Jewish values of kindness and justice and compassion to other people. I know of no other person as brave as this to take this on. And I'm gonna start out in that way, which should set the right tone, which the tone I want to set is one of confrontation, but also good humor, and also friendship and conviviality, which I appreciate here. I thank Sharon for setting this up, and I look forward to seeing you on many future happy occasions that are coming up. Anybody else want to share anything or close out, or are we done here?
I just wanted to ask, do we want to have any candidate forums for the upcoming election?
That is a very good idea. Thank you for mentioning it. And yes, that's a great idea. I will try to set that up starting tomorrow.
You know, with the people that are on the ballot for both, you know, Republican and whoever, rather than just a bunch of Democrats, so that we can
Oh,
see both sides.
No, we're not going to have a bunch of Democrats, not at
Right,
all.
so we could
I'm
have
gonna-
it, mix it up.
Oh yeah, well, what we'll do is we'll get the candidates who are opposing each other. We'll try to
Absolutely.
either for governor, for a senator, for a state reps, state senate. Yes, absolutely. I should
great.
have done that before. I was preoccupied with other stuff, but thank you, Sharon. I'll get
Yeah.
on that first thing tomorrow.
Yeah, that'd be nice. We can set it up on Zoom and send that out to people to learn about those candidates. That's great.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
all. Thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope to see you at Friday night Shabbat, Sunday's Simchat Torah, and have a great week. Good health. L'Shana Tova. Happy and healthy New Year. Thanks, everybody.
And live long and prosper. Good night.